He dated the most beautiful women in the world, supermodels, actresses, icons every man dreamed of. Yet at 50, Leonardo DiCaprio has never walked down the aisle, never exchanged vows, never said, "I do." For decades, the world mocked him, calling it a joke, a curse, even a scandal. But now, for the first time, Leo himself finally admits the real reason why he will never marry. And it's not what you think. Long before the red carpets, the screaming fans, and the billion-dollar box office, Leonardo DiCaprio was just a little boy growing up in the rough neighborhoods of Los Angeles. His parents' marriage collapsed almost as soon as it began. By the time Leo was barely a year old, his mother was already raising him alone. The image of a complete, loving family, the kind of stability most children take for granted, was something Leo never had. His father, George, was a free-spirited artist, drifting between homes, while his mother, Ermeline, carried the crushing responsibility of survival. She worked multiple jobs, often coming home exhausted, but determined to provide. Leo would later recall sitting in dingy apartments, watching his mother sacrifice everything, and realizing how fragile love and partnership could be. The divorce left a wound that never truly healed. To young Leonardo, marriage wasn't a promise of safety or happiness, it was a ticking time bomb. He saw his mother's silent tears, the loneliness in her eyes, and the weight she carried alone. That vision carved deep into his subconscious. Love, no matter how passionate, could end in abandonment. Even as a child, he told friends that he wanted to make it big, not for fame or money, but to give his mother the life she deserved. She became his rock, his compass, and his only model of devotion. Yet, paradoxically, the same devotion also built a quiet fear inside him. If his mother, the strongest person he knew, could be broken by love, what chance did he stand? This fractured foundation would shadow Leo for decades. Every romance he would later enter carried the ghost of his childhood, the fear that history would repeat itself. As Leonardo grew, one figure loomed larger than anyone else in his life: his mother, Ermeline. She wasn't just the parent who raised him. She was his protector, his guide, his anchor in a world that often felt hostile and uncertain. When money was tight, she took on whatever work she could find, riding buses across Los Angeles to make ends meet. When he dreamed of acting, she was the one who pushed him forward, sitting in long casting lines, never letting him give up. Leo would later say that every ounce of success he achieved was because of her. She was the reason he fought so hard, the reason he kept his feet on the ground when fame came rushing in. But with that devotion came something else, an unintended shadow. Watching his mother pour her entire life into him, never remarrying, never seeking her own happiness, planted an idea deep inside Leo's mind. Marriage meant sacrifice. It meant giving up your freedom, your identity, and sometimes your dreams. For Ermeline, Leo was enough. She built her life around him, and while it was an act of love, it also became a cautionary tale. He adored her, but he also feared repeating her fate. If love required that level of sacrifice, was it even worth it? Could he ever ask another woman to give up what his mother gave up? This paradox would haunt him for decades. On one hand, Ermeline showed him unconditional love and loyalty. On the other, she became proof that love could be a burden, a chain disguised as devotion. To Leo, the lesson was clear. Marriage was not just a union, it was a responsibility so heavy it could crush even the strongest person he knew. And so, as he stepped into adolescence, his view of relationships was already marked by suspicion and fear. That fear would only grow when fate handed him a gift and a curse that changed everything. By the mid-1990 seconds, Leonardo was already a rising star, with films like Romeo plus Juliet and What's Eating Gilbert Grape earning him critical acclaim. But nothing could have prepared him or the world for what came next. In 1997, James Cameron cast him as Jack Dawson in Titanic. At just 22 years old, Leonardo went from a talented young actor to the most recognizable face on the planet. Overnight, he became the heartthrob of an entire generation. The film shattered box office records and turned Leo into a living legend. His face was on posters in bedrooms across the globe. His smile replayed endlessly on television, his every move dissected by the press. What most people saw was the dream: fame, fortune, adoration. What Leo experienced was something very different. Titanic didn't just change his career, it erased his privacy. He couldn't walk down the street without being swarmed. Crowds screamed his name. Cameras followed him everywhere. Strangers tried to touch him as if he belonged to them. Even his friendships and casual outings became headlines. The boy who once lived quietly with his mother in Los Angeles was suddenly trapped in a glass cage, admired by millions but seen by no one. And in that storm of attention, Leo began to understand something crucial. Fame and intimacy could not coexist. Every woman he spoke to, every glance, every night out was turned into a story. Rumors exploded, often before the truth had a chance to form. What chance did a relationship have when the whole world was trying to own it? Titanic had given him everything he had ever dreamed of, but at the same time, it stole something he could never get back: his sense of a private, personal life. And that loss would follow him into every romance that came after. The global success of Titanic should have been a fairy tale. For Leonardo, it was closer to a prison sentence. Fame didn't arrive gently, it crashed down like a tidal wave, drowning any sense of normalcy he might have clung to. Paparazzi chased his car, camped outside his home, and stalked him through airports. He couldn't step into a restaurant without flashbulbs exploding in his face. At just 23, the world had turned him into a possession, not a person. What hurt the most wasn't just the constant intrusion, but the distortion. Tabloids twisted every interaction into gossip. A handshake became a fling. A smile became an affair. Young women who stood near him were suddenly splashed across headlines as his new girlfriend, and the more they wrote, the less real his life felt. It was like being in a fishbowl, Leo once admitted. You can't tell who's with you because of you, and who's there because of what you represent. End pert. For a boy who had grown up watching his mother give up everything for love, the message was brutal. Relationships didn't just seem risky, they seemed impossible. Any attempt at intimacy would be consumed by cameras and critics before it had a chance to breathe. The thought of dragging another person into that chaos filled him with guilt. So Leonardo began to retreat. He partied loudly with his infamous wolf pack of friends, but emotionally, he built walls. Those walls kept him safe, but they also kept him alone. Fame had delivered the success he once dreamed of giving his mother, but it demanded a toll. His right to love without scrutiny, his chance at building a quiet family of his own, and it was in this crucible of constant attention that a new fear was born. A fear that would shape every romance he entered from that moment forward. By his mid-20s, Leonardo had learned a harsh truth. The world was not going to let him love in peace. Every relationship, no matter how casual or serious, became a public spectacle. A simple walk with a woman turned into front-page news. A dinner date was dissected by tabloids, complete with fabricated details. Even a friendship could be twisted into scandal if the cameras captured a single smile too long. For Leo, who had already grown up wary of fragile relationships, this was devastating. Love requires privacy, vulnerability, and trust, three things fame had stolen from him. Instead, every gesture was scrutinized, mocked, or magnified beyond recognition. Women he dated often bore the brunt of it too. Overnight, they would be hounded by reporters, labeled as opportunists, or reduced to nothing more than Leo's new conquest. That constant pressure did something to him. It made him guarded, cautious, almost paranoid about letting anyone too close. He began to dread the idea of taking a relationship public, because the moment it went public, it no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the world. And when you cannot protect the people you care about from the cruelty of that world, you begin to wonder if it's better not to start at all. That thought lingered like a shadow in Leo's mind. He still craved connection, he still longed, in his quietest moments, for a love that could outlast the chaos. But with every headline and every paparazzi chase, the possibility of that love seemed more and more out of reach. This fear didn't stop him from dating, but it made every relationship feel doomed from the start. And soon, the women he chose, and the way those relationships ended, would only deepen the mystery surrounding him. If Leonardo DiCaprio couldn't protect his love life from the spotlight, he also couldn't escape the fascination it stirred. The women who entered his orbit were some of the most celebrated faces of their generation: supermodels, actresses, icons of beauty and youth. To the world, it seemed like an endless parade of perfection. To Leo, it was often something far more complicated. His earliest high-profile romance was with Gisele Bündchen, the Brazilian supermodel who was herself on the cusp of becoming a legend. For nearly 5 years, they were inseparable, photographed on red carpets, vacations, and fashion shows. Yet behind the glamour, Gisele grew tired of Leo's restless lifestyle, his late-night parties, and his reluctance to settle down. By 2005, she walked away, later admitting that she wanted more than Leo could give. Not long after, Leo's name was linked to Refaeli, the Israeli supermodel whose beauty seemed to mesmerize the fashion world. Their relationship spanned 5 years, though it was filled with breaks and reconciliations. Friends described it as intense, but fragile. Once again, when commitment loomed, the connection frayed. There were others too, actresses like Blake Lively, who famously dated him for a brief but highly publicized summer, and a string of models who seemed to fit the Leo pattern: young, beautiful, and usually under 25. By the time he began dating Camila Morrone in 2017, the public had already branded him with a cruel stereotype: the man who would never date a woman past her mid-20s. What outsiders failed to see was the human cost behind the gossip. Each woman entered the relationship hoping for something real, but was met with suffocating attention and endless speculation. For Leo, the cycle became predictable. Love would spark, the world would swarm, and eventually, the weight of scrutiny would crush whatever they had built. To many, it looked like Leo was the one doing the leaving. But the truth was far more painful, and it was about to surface in a way few expected. As Leonardo's list of romances grew longer, so did the jokes. Late-night hosts mocked him, tabloids coined nicknames, and social media turned his love life into a running gag. The narrative was simple, cruel, and relentless. Leonardo DiCaprio only dated women under 25, and once they reached that age, he moved on. It didn't matter that some of his relationships had lasted years, or that breakups were often mutual. The world preferred the punchline. Memes exploded whenever a girlfriend's birthday approached, predicting the inevitable split. Headlines screamed that Leo was afraid of commitment, that he couldn't handle women who had outgrown their youth. For a man who valued his privacy, the ridicule was humiliating. What had once been deeply personal moments of love, heartbreak, and vulnerability was reduced to cheap entertainment. It was as if the public had written his fate in stone, a perpetual bachelor, incapable of serious love. But what few realized was that the stereotype cut both ways. While Leo was mocked for leaving, in truth, he was often the one left behind. Gisele wanted stability. Refaeli grew tired of waiting. Others simply couldn't endure the circus that came with dating him. The so-called 25-year rule was less a deliberate pattern and more a tragic consequence of lives moving in different directions. Still, the damage was done. The joke stung, the label stuck, and Leo retreated even further into himself. The older he grew, the more impossible it seemed to shake off the caricature. To the world, he was the eternal playboy. To Leo, he was a man trapped in a narrative he never chose. And behind that narrative lay something far darker, a fear of marriage rooted not in immaturity, but in wounds that had been festering since childhood. Those wounds, and the shadow of broken families all around him, would explain the truth no one wanted to believe. Beneath the flashy headlines and the endless jokes, there was a truth Leonardo DiCaprio rarely spoke about, a truth that flipped the narrative the world had written for him. For years, People believed he was the one who kept running, the man who couldn't commit, the eternal bachelor discarding women when they no longer fit the image. But behind closed doors, it was often Leo who was left standing alone. Gisele Bündchen was the first to walk away. After nearly 5 years, she grew weary of his wild lifestyle and his refusal to slow down. She longed for stability, marriage, and a family. Leo wasn't ready, and instead of waiting, she chose a different path. Refaeli, too, ended their 5-year relationship on her terms, craving something deeper, something Leo, burdened by fame and his own fears, couldn't provide. Even Camila Morrone, who stood by him for the longest time, eventually stepped back when it became clear he was unwilling to cross that final line into marriage. Each time, the world painted Leo as the heartbreaker, but in reality, he was the one absorbing the heartbreak. He was the one watching women he loved leave in search of a life he couldn't promise. He wasn't chasing youth, he was chasing connection. And too often, that connection was broken not because he wanted it, but because he couldn't overcome the walls he had built around himself. This pattern wasn't the Playboy fantasy the tabloids loved to sell, it was a tragedy repeating itself. Just as his father had left his mother, Leo found himself abandoned again and again, though this time by choice rather than betrayal. And each goodbye reinforced the lesson he had learned as a child. Love doesn't last, no matter how deeply you want it to. It's this hidden heartbreak, this cycle of being left behind, that explains why marriage, to Leonardo, feels less like a milestone and more like a risk he's too scarred to take. For years, Leonardo DiCaprio dodged the question with charm and humor. Interviewers would ask him when he was finally going to settle down, and he would smile, deflect, or crack a joke. But behind the carefully rehearsed answers lay a truth far heavier than anyone suspected. The real reason he never married was not arrogance, nor immaturity, nor the endless parade of models. It was fear raw, consuming fear. Leo had seen what marriage could do. He had lived through the collapse of his parents' relationship before he was old enough to understand it, and he had watched his mother carry the weight of that collapse for decades. He had seen friends in Hollywood walk down the aisle with hope in their eyes, only to be dragged through ugly divorces, betrayals, custody battles, and heartbreaks splashed across magazine covers. Fame didn't just complicate marriage, it destroyed it. And so, Leo came to believe that committing himself fully to someone would not end in happily ever after, it would end in disaster. More than that, he carried a crushing guilt, the awareness that his fame was a burden no partner should have to bear. He knew what the paparazzi would do, what the tabloids would invent, how merciless the world could be to anyone who dared love him openly. "I don't want to hurt someone by bringing them into this circus," he once admitted privately to a friend. That sentiment shaped his life. For Leo, marriage wasn't about rings or ceremonies, it was about sacrifice. And he could not ask another person to sacrifice their peace, their freedom, their identity for him. To the public, his bachelorhood looked like selfishness. To Leonardo, it was an act of protection. He stayed away from the altar not because he didn't value love, but because he valued it too much to risk destroying it. Leonardo DiCaprio didn't just carry the ghost of his parents' failed marriage, he was surrounded, at every stage of his life, by cautionary tales of love collapsing under pressure. Growing up in Hollywood meant he didn't just see stardom, he saw what it did to relationships. His peers, his mentors, even his closest friends seemed to fall into the same cycle, a glamorous wedding, followed by years of tension, ending with bitter divorces that played out under the harsh glare of the tabloids. He watched fellow actors, some of whom had once told him that love was the only thing that mattered, go through devastating separations. Careers that demanded constant travel, the seduction of fame, and the relentless spotlight seemed to poison even the strongest bonds. Leo saw how children became pawns in custody battles, how trust shattered in front of the cameras, and how once beautiful love stories turned into headlines dripping with humiliation. These weren't strangers. They were people he admired, people he worked with, people he called friends. If their marriages couldn't withstand the pressure, why would his be any different? To him, marriage in Hollywood wasn't a sanctuary. It was a gamble where the odds were stacked against you. This fear wasn't just hypothetical. It was deeply personal. Leo's own father had walked away from his marriage, leaving Irmelin to carry the scars alone. The pain he saw in his mother's eyes became a warning that no success, no affection, could guarantee permanence. Every failed marriage around him echoed that warning louder. To the outside world, it looked like Leo was avoiding responsibility. But inside, he felt he was sparing himself and the women he loved from a fate he had witnessed too many times. For Leonardo DiCaprio, marriage wasn't a promise of forever. It was a risk of repeating a cycle he had sworn never to inflict on anyone else. At the heart of Leonardo DiCaprio's hesitation lay a conviction he rarely voiced aloud. He did not believe he was worthy of the kind of sacrifice marriage demanded. To most of the world, Leo was the ultimate prize, a Hollywood king, an Oscar winner, a man with wealth, power, and influence. But when he looked in the mirror, what he saw was a man whose life was built on instability, excess, and shadows. He had spent decades being chased by cameras, mocked by tabloids, and scrutinized by millions. Any woman who chose to stand by his side had to endure the same torment, sometimes even worse. He knew the way reporters would stalk them, how social media would tear them apart, how the very act of loving him would cost them their privacy and their peace. To Leo, asking someone to live with that burden was asking too much. "I don't want anyone to give up their life for me," he once confided. Those words weren't empty, they were a reflection of the guilt he carried. He saw what his mother sacrificed to raise him, how she gave up pieces of herself so he could thrive. That love had saved him, but it had also haunted him. If the strongest woman he had ever known could be broken by devotion, how could he ever believe another woman wouldn't be destroyed by his world? So he convinced himself it was better to let love slip away than to risk dragging someone into his storm. He retreated behind emotional walls, protecting those he cared about by keeping them at arm's length. To outsiders, it looked cold, even selfish. But in Leo's mind, it was an act of mercy. And yet, despite his fears, there came a moment when the cycle nearly broke a relationship that lasted longer than all the rest, that looked like it might finally change his story. When Leonardo DiCaprio met Camila Morrone in 2017, something felt different. She wasn't just another fleeting romance splashed across tabloids. She was young, yes, but also intelligent, grounded, and ambitious in her own right. Unlike many before her, Camila seemed undaunted by the circus surrounding Leo's life. For a while, the world believed she might be the one to finally break the so-called Leo curse. Their relationship lasted for 5 years longer than any other in his past. They traveled together, spent holidays as a couple, and were even photographed quietly blending into family gatherings. Friends described Leo as more at ease with Camila, more willing to let his guard down. He took her to high-profile events, allowed cameras to catch them together, and even seemed comfortable with whispers of marriage. For the first time, people wondered if he was ready to step beyond the walls he had built. Camila herself appeared to fit into his life seamlessly, supporting his career while pursuing her own in acting and modeling. She wasn't overshadowed by his fame. She carried herself with grace and independence, something Leo respected deeply. Yet, beneath the surface, the same fears still lingered. Every milestone in their relationship was met with public commentary. As Camila approached her mid-20s, the old jokes resurfaced. Would Leo stay? Would the rule finally be broken? The speculation wasn't just cruel, it was suffocating. It turned a private bond into a public countdown. Still, 5 years was proof of something undeniable. Leo had been willing to try, to stretch further than he ever had before. With Camila, he had come closer than ever to rewriting his narrative. For a fleeting moment, it looked as if the man who had sworn off marriage might finally choose love over fear. But just as hope began to bloom, the inevitable silence followed a breakup that was quiet, dignified, and yet deeply telling. In 2022, after 5 years together, Leonardo DiCaprio and Camila Morrone ended their relationship. There was no scandal, no explosive headlines of betrayal, no bitter public feud. Instead, the breakup arrived like a whisper, quiet, almost respectful, but heavy with unspoken meaning. For a man whose every romantic move had been turned into a spectacle, this silence spoke volumes. Friends close to the couple revealed that there was no dramatic fight. It was more a drifting apart, a recognition that the relationship had reached its natural end. Camila, entering her mid-20s, was ready for the next chapter of her life, one that perhaps included deeper commitment and stability. Leonardo, though deeply fond of her, could not give what she hoped for. The old fears returned, and with them, the same invisible barrier that had haunted him for decades. The world reacted with predictable cynicism. Headlines mocked the timing, once again pointing to the infamous 25-year rule. Social media erupted with memes, treating the end of a 5-year relationship like the punchline to a tired joke. Yet what was lost in all that noise was the truth. This was not a man discarding a woman because of her age. This was a couple whose lives were pulling them in different directions, ending their story with dignity instead of destruction. Still, the breakup left a mark on Leo. With Camila, he had allowed himself to hope, to imagine something different. And when it ended, quietly and without drama, it reinforced his belief that perhaps marriage, commitment, and permanence simply weren't written into his destiny. The pain wasn't in losing her to scandal, it was in losing her to inevitability. For Leonardo DiCaprio, the quiet breakup was a reminder that even the longest relationship of his life couldn't undo the lessons of his past. And so, he withdrew once more, retreating further from the glare of public scrutiny, choosing solitude over the risk of repeating heartbreak again. After his quiet separation from Camila Morrone, Leonardo DiCaprio began to change the rhythm of his life. He had always been intensely private, but now, his retreat felt deliberate, almost like a final act of self-preservation. He stopped appearing arm in arm with new girlfriends at high-profile events. Paparazzi photos became rarer, and when they did surface, Leo was often surrounded not by glamorous women, but by his small circle of longtime friends or his devoted mother, Irmelin. This wasn't the reckless bachelor lifestyle the tabloids had spent years mocking. It was something quieter, more intentional. At 50, Leonardo seemed to be rewriting his image, not as the eternal playboy, but as a man who had chosen solitude. He poured more of his time into his philanthropic work, especially his environmental foundation, where he could exert influence without sacrificing his privacy. In interviews, he shifted the conversation away from his personal life entirely, refusing to fuel the cycle of gossip that had once defined him. There was a sense of calm in his absence. Hollywood, always hungry for drama, found itself with little to mock. Without the fuel of new relationships or public appearances, the Leo dating jokes began to lose their sting. Instead, a different narrative began to form. Perhaps Leonardo wasn't running from love. Perhaps he was simply done letting the world dictate how he lived it. By stepping away from the spotlight, he regained something he had lost since Titanic first catapulted him to global fame: control. For the first time in decades, his love life was not a headline, but a mystery again. And in that mystery, Leo seemed to find a strange kind of peace. Still, questions lingered. Would he ever let someone close enough to break through those walls? Or had he already made his choice that solitude was safer, and perhaps even sweeter, than risking heartbreak one more time? Turning 50 marked a quiet but undeniable shift in Leonardo DiCaprio's life. To the outside world, it was just another birthday, another reminder that the heartthrob of Titanic was no longer the boyish Jack Dawson frozen in time. But for Leo himself, it was a milestone, a point of reflection where the noise of fame, the weight of expectation, and the sting of past heartbreaks finally settled into a kind of acceptance. He was no longer chasing the highs of celebrity. The days of late-night parties with his wolf pack had faded into the background. Instead, his focus had turned toward causes he deeply cared about: climate change, wildlife preservation, and philanthropy. The man once mocked for his endless dating life now spoke more often about the planet than about romance. Fame had once been the center of his existence. Now, it felt like a byproduct of his real work. And yet, what stood out most was his attitude toward solitude. Unlike in his 20s, when loneliness felt like a wound, at 50, Leo wore it almost like a badge of honor. He wasn't bitter, nor was he desperate to prove the world wrong. Instead, he seemed to embrace the idea that his life did not need to fit the conventional script. He could live without marriage, without children, and still find fulfillment in art, friendship, and purpose. For many, his bachelorhood at 50 looked like a failure. But for Leo, it was liberation. He had learned that happiness was not measured by rings or anniversaries, but by authenticity, by living a life on his own terms. And as he looked back at the chaos of his early fame, and the pain of relationships that could not withstand it, he began to see that perhaps he had chosen the only path that could truly protect his peace. Still, even in this acceptance, he offered the world a glimpse of his philosophy, a single statement that revealed how he truly saw love and commitment after half a century of life. For decades, Leonardo DiCaprio had dodged, joked, and sidestepped questions about marriage. But as he entered his 50s, he finally allowed a sliver of honesty to surface, one that captured the core of his philosophy on love. In an interview, when pressed yet again on why he had never married, he gave an answer that was disarmingly simple, but cut deeper than any tabloid headline ever had. Marriage is not a failure, but pretending you're ready when you're not island. In those few words, Leo revealed the truth he had carried for years. To him, the true betrayal wasn't in choosing to stay single, it was in forcing yourself into a lifelong commitment when your heart wasn't prepared. He had seen too many people, actors, friends, even his parents, destroy each other by pretending they were ready for forever. He refused to do the same. That statement reframed his entire life. Suddenly, his bachelorhood wasn't about immaturity or selfishness, it was about honesty. It wasn't that he didn't value love. It was that he valued it too much to counterfeit it. He would rather endure mockery, loneliness, even misunderstanding, than drag someone into a union doomed to collapse under the weight of doubt. And those words resonated far beyond Hollywood. Fans who had once ridiculed him began to see his stance in a different light. Some admired his courage to live authentically, while others admitted his perspective forced them to confront their own rushed choices. For Leonardo, it wasn't about convincing anyone, it was about finally giving language to the decision that had defined his life. That one quote became the key to unlocking his story, turning ridicule into reflection, and it left the world with a final, haunting question, one that lingered long after the interviews ended. For years, the question had followed Leonardo DiCaprio everywhere. When will you finally get married? It was asked at premieres, whispered at award shows, splashed across magazine covers, and turned into punchlines on late-night television. To the world, marriage was the missing piece of his puzzle, the final box left unchecked in a life filled with success. But as Leo turned 50, the narrative began to shift. He had endured the ridicule, outlasted the jokes, and lived long enough for people to see something they had missed all along. Maybe Leonardo DiCaprio didn't need marriage to validate his life. Maybe he never did. He had built one of the most impressive acting careers in Hollywood history, finally winning the Oscar that had eluded him for so long. He had used his wealth and influence to fight for the planet, lending his voice to causes far greater than himself. He had remained close to his mother, honoring the woman who had sacrificed everything for him. And through it all, he had stayed true to his own boundaries, even when the world mocked him for it. In the end, Leo's story wasn't about running from love or refusing to grow up. It was about courage, the courage to resist, the pressure to conform, the courage to admit he wasn't ready, and the courage to live life on his own terms. His solitude wasn't a tragedy, it was a choice. And so the question is no longer, when will Leonardo DiCaprio get married? The question is, does he even need to? For Leonardo, the answer has already been written in the life he has chosen. For the rest of us, it remains a reminder that happiness doesn't always wear a wedding ring, and love doesn't always have to end with, "I do."